shared custody seemed straightforward on paper. 3 children, ages 16, 14, and 12, divided evenly between 2 homes. No child support, no financial entanglements beyond what each parent contributed individually. But reality, as I learned quickly, is always messier than paperwork. Our marriage hadn't ended gracefully. There was resentment, lingering frustrations, and unresolved anger simmering just beneath the surface. We communicated only when necessary, strictly through an app designed to keep records, designed to minimize direct contact, to reduce conflict for the sake of the kids. And yet, even this sanitized system couldn't prevent the tension that seemed to follow us like a shadow. When my ex remarried, adding a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old stepchild into the mix, the dynamics became even more complicated. I didn't communicate with her new husband, and he didn't communicate with me. Each home existed almost like parallel universes, connected only by the children's presence, intersecting briefly during exchanges and holidays, but otherwise separate and tense. The kids navigated these differences with remarkable resilience, but I often wondered what impact it was having on their sense of security and fairness. The first real clash over property came with something seemingly trivial: a phone. I had given our eldest my old cell phone after one of my ex's stepchildren had broken theirs. It was a simple gesture meant to help our child continue connecting with friends and schoolwork without interruption. But when I expected the phone to be returned after a period, she refused. She insisted she had every right to keep it, despite my attempts to retrieve it in person. I followed up with an email documenting the exchange, and her reply was a curt, "Get over it." "I'm not handing it back." At the time, it was baffling. A phone, something tangible, something clearly mine, became a battlefield. The situation escalated, slowly but predictably. When our daughter needed some of my tools for a school project, the timing of custody exchanges complicated the situation. She left my house on a custody day, headed to her mother's home, and my ex decided it was inappropriate for her to possess my property. Again, she confiscated the items and refused to return them, and again I had written proof via our custody app. Every interaction seemed to reinforce a pattern. The property belonged to me, but once it was in her home, it became hers to control. I began to notice a disturbing trend. What belonged to me for my children's use could easily be reappropriated by my ex for the benefit of her household, including her stepchildren. The principle seemed simple. What I provided for my kids was for their use and only theirs. But her interpretation differed sharply. My boundaries, my intentions, and my ownership didn't matter when her perspective took precedence. And with each incident, the message became clearer. My role as a parent was being undermined, not through exclusion from the children, but through the restriction of what I could provide them. The iPod incident with our youngest was the final straw. I allowed him to use an old iPod for a class assignment on historical tech, a small gesture meant to support his education. But she decided that her 13-year-old stepchild also had a claim, and both children needed access. When I reminded her that the iPod was mine and intended solely for my child, she resisted. Emails were exchanged, polite in form but pointed in content, documenting her refusal. At that point, I contacted the police, not out of malice, but as a means to reclaim property that rightfully belonged to me. Her reaction was extreme. She accused me of overreacting, of being petty, of allowing a minor dispute to escalate unnecessarily. She argued that I could have waited until her stepchild finished using it, but I saw it differently. This wasn't about the iPod itself. It was about respect, boundaries, and the precedent it set for future interactions. My children were entitled to what I provided for them, and her stepchildren had no claim over that. When the authorities got involved, the items were returned, but the confrontation left a bitter residue. I realized that these incidents were not isolated. They were symptomatic of a larger issue, a refusal to respect boundaries, to acknowledge my role as a parent with rights over my property when it was meant for my children. Every tool, every device, every resource I provided became a potential source of conflict. And each confrontation, while seemingly minor in isolation, accumulated into a broader narrative of tension, mistrust, and parental rivalry. Even the tone of communication through our app reflected this struggle. Messages were curt, dismissive, and often framed as moralizing lectures. "It's not a big deal, you're just being spiteful. You wouldn't have given it anyway." These statements were designed to undermine, to delegitimize my position, and to shift blame. The impact wasn't just practical, it was emotional. I began to feel that my contributions as a parent were constantly questioned, that my intentions were never taken at face value, and that my role was being deliberately minimized. This chapter of conflict wasn't just about items. It was about power. Each piece of property became a symbol, a small stake in a larger struggle over authority, respect, and recognition in co-parenting. The children, thankfully, remained largely unaware of the deeper implications, enjoying their tools, phones, and devices in the moment. But for me, each confrontation left a lasting impression, a reminder that even in a structured custody arrangement, peace and fairness were never guaranteed. I started strategizing. Every exchange, every visit, every handoff became an exercise in foresight and documentation. I kept records meticulously, understanding that a pattern of evidence could support me in disputes. I considered the timing of each item, the likelihood of conflict, and the potential reactions of my ex. This wasn't paranoia. It was a necessity. In a system where communication was limited and boundaries were contested, preparation became a form of protection. Even mundane parenting tasks carried an underlying tension, providing resources, assisting with schoolwork, offering support. Things I had once done without thought now required negotiation, anticipation, and often confrontation. Each victory was small but significant. Retrieving a phone, reclaiming a tool, asserting my rights over an iPod. These were symbolic as much as practical, reminders that my role as a parent could not be entirely overridden, even by the person who had once shared my life intimately, despite the friction. I remained committed to maintaining the focus on our children. The property disputes, while frustrating and emotionally draining, were secondary to the larger goal, ensuring my kids had access to the resources they needed, the attention they deserved, and a consistent presence from both parents. Every confrontation reinforced the importance of advocating for them, of not allowing external conflicts to compromise their well-being or access to what was rightfully theirs. Looking back, I can see how these incidents shaped the co-parenting relationship. Each conflict over property revealed underlying issues, mistrust, lack of communication, differing priorities, and the challenge of navigating blended family dynamics. My ex's new family introduced additional complications, but the core issue remained consistent. My rights and intentions as a parent were being challenged whenever my contributions intersected with her household. The challenges of custody and property disputes are rarely dramatic in isolation. They manifest in small, persistent ways, eroding trust and creating friction that colors every interaction. What began as a simple phone, a set of tools, and an iPod became emblematic of the broader struggle for respect and authority within our shared parenting arrangement. And in that struggle, I discovered the necessity of clear boundaries, documentation, and assertiveness. Even when the other party resists or protests, I realized that co-parenting is not just about scheduling, shared responsibility, or communication. It is about recognizing and respecting boundaries, understanding intent, and prioritizing the children above personal grievances. The property disputes illuminated what was at stake, not just the tangible items themselves, but the underlying principles of fairness, respect, and parental authority in navigating these disputes. I learned patience, persistence, and the importance of maintaining composure. I also learned that asserting rights is not equivalent to aggression, that defending what is meant for my children is both justified and necessary. While the incidents were frustrating, they reinforced my understanding of co-parenting as an active, engaged, and sometimes challenging process, requiring vigilance, strategy, and unwavering commitment. Through all of this, my children remained central. Their needs, their education, and their access to resources guided my actions. The frustration with my ex was secondary. The priority was ensuring that my kids could continue their lives uninterrupted, with support and materials I provided without being appropriated by others. My role as a parent demanded advocacy, clarity, and sometimes confrontation, but always with the children's best interests in mind. After the initial property disputes, I realized that these weren't isolated incidents, they were recurring challenges that threatened not only my sense of fairness, but also the stability of our co-parenting arrangement. Every time my ex withheld something that belonged to me, even if it was intended solely for my children, it became an opportunity for conflict, frustration, and strained communication. The incidents, though seemingly smaller phone tools, an iPod served as reminders that boundaries in our relationship were constantly being tested. The phone situation set a precedent early on. I had given our eldest my old phone to help him manage school and social responsibilities after her stepchild had damaged theirs. This was an act purely for the benefit of my child, without any expectation of permanence. Yet, when I sought its return, she insisted on keeping it, asserting control over what was legally and morally mine. I followed up with emails, keeping a written record, but her responses were dismissive. Get over it. I'm not giving it back. At the time, I thought it was petty, but it revealed a deeper problem, a lack of respect for parental property and autonomy. The tools incident with our 14-year-old daughter reinforced the pattern. She needed my tools for a school project, a simple educational necessity, and yet my ex confiscated them when she arrived at her house. Even though it was only for a temporary assignment, she refused to return them. And I once again had written proof through the custody app. The repeated necessity of asserting my rights created an ongoing tension that extended far beyond these material items. Each confrontation chipped away at the fragile lines of cooperation we had tried to maintain. These incidents affected more than property, they affected trust, respect, and the emotional landscape of our co-parenting. Each dispute introduced a sense of uncertainty. When my children returned from her home, would they come back with their belongings intact, or would I have to request their return? Was every object a potential source of conflict? The emotional labor involved in navigating these disputes was exhausting, yet necessary. I couldn't allow my children to lose access to resources that belonged to them. Resources I had provided. That the iPod incident with my youngest exemplified the culmination of these tensions. He needed it for a class assignment on historical tech. Her stepchild, who coincidentally had the same assignment on a different day, became part of the dispute. I reminded her repeatedly that the device was mine and intended for my child, but she resisted, claiming both should have access. I documented everything through emails and eventually involved the police. My goal was never to escalate unnecessarily, but to assert ownership and protect my child's right to use what I provided. Her reaction to involving authorities was extreme. She accused me of being petty, spiteful, and unnecessarily escalating the situation. Yet, from my perspective, the escalation was not only justified but necessary. The incidents were not trivial. They were symptomatic of a recurring refusal to respect boundaries and recognize my authority as a parent. Allowing these disputes to continue without resolution would set a dangerous precedent, signaling that my property and decisions could be overridden at her discretion. Throughout these conflicts, I maintained a focus on the children. My actions were always aimed at ensuring they had access to the resources they needed. The frustration I felt with my ex was secondary to the importance of supporting their education, hobbies, and daily life. I understood that allowing her stepchildren to claim resources intended for my kids would blur boundaries and create confusion about fairness and entitlement. It was critical to establish that what I provide is for my children, not for any other party. Navigating these disputes required a delicate balance. I had to assert my rights without turning every interaction into a confrontation. I had to document everything while remaining calm and composed, even when provoked. I had to communicate clearly with my ex, despite her resistance to rational discussion, and ensure that my children did not absorb unnecessary stress. This required vigilance, patience, and strategic thinking, skills I had honed over years of dealing with a challenging co-parenting dynamic. The emotional toll was undeniable. Constantly defending what was rightfully mine, negotiating access, and managing conflicts drained my energy and tested my patience. But I recognized that without action, the cycle would continue indefinitely. My children deserved stability, clarity, and access to the resources I provided. I couldn't compromise on that, even if it meant challenging my ex repeatedly. Repeated incidents revealed the broader challenge of co-parenting. In a blended family, her remarriage and stepchildren introduced new dynamics, often complicating what should have been simple interactions. I wasn't involved in her household, nor were her husband and I in communication. Yet, his presence, along with her stepchildren, created additional considerations that influenced her decisions, often at the expense of fairness or reason. My role as a parent became a constant negotiation against external and internal pressures. Through these disputes, I learned important lessons about boundaries and co-parenting. Property, though seemingly trivial, was a tangible measure of respect and authority. Allowing my ex to withhold items for her own purposes would erode my ability to parent effectively. Maintaining written records, clear communication, and the willingness to escalate when necessary became essential tools for safeguarding my children's interests. Every interaction underscored a key principle. My contributions and resources are meant for my children, not for her household or stepchildren. Ensuring this principle required persistence, assertiveness, and sometimes formal intervention. It was never about conflict for its own sake. It was about maintaining fairness, setting boundaries, and protecting the children's access to what is rightfully theirs. Even as tensions rose, I remained conscious of the importance of emotional regulation. Escalating every dispute into a personal confrontation would have been counterproductive, potentially damaging the co-parenting relationship further and affecting the children. I had to differentiate between what required firm action and what could be managed through communication, all while maintaining a record in case intervention became necessary. These recurring property disputes shaped not only the co-parenting dynamic, but also my understanding of blended family challenges. Integrating new household members, stepchildren, and extended family complicates routines, authority, and expectations. Without clear boundaries, the risk of conflict grows exponentially. I learned that clarity, documentation, and assertiveness are vital, even when navigating delicate family relationships. Despite the stress, my commitment to my children remained unwavering. Every decision, every escalation, every request for return of property was guided by the principle that they deserve access to the resources provided by their parents. My role as a father required vigilance, protection, and sometimes confrontation, but always with their best interests at the forefront. By the end of this chapter of escalating conflicts, it was clear that co-parenting is never simple, especially in a blended family. Respect, boundaries, and clear communication are essential, and violations, no matter how small they appear, can have cascading effects. The phone, the tools, the iPod were more than objects. They were symbols of parental rights, boundaries, and the ongoing effort to ensure my children received fair treatment. After repeatedly facing these disputes, I realized I needed to assert my boundaries more firmly. The property conflicts were not about the items themselves, they were about respect, authority, and the principle that what I provide for my children belongs to them, not her household or stepchildren. My ex's resistance, though frustrating, clarified the necessity of formalizing my stance. I began documenting every interaction meticulously, using emails and the custody app as a record of the exchanges. Each incident, whether over a phone, tools, or an iPod, became evidence supporting my right to maintain my role as a parent without interference. The situation reached its peak with the iPod incident. My youngest needed it for a school assignment, and my ex decided it should be shared with her stepchild, disregarding the fact that the device was mine and intended for my child. Despite repeated polite requests and email documentation, her refusal persisted. I finally contacted the police to intervene, not as an act of malice, but as a necessary measure to assert ownership and protect my child's access. The resolution came with a return of the property, but also with a furious backlash from my ex, who accused me of being petty, spiteful, and unnecessarily escalating the situation. Her reaction, though intense, reinforced my understanding of the boundaries I needed to maintain. I had to separate personal feelings from parental responsibilities. The items in question were not just gadgets or tools, they were extensions of my ability to support my children's education and daily life. Allowing them to be appropriated by her stepchildren would have set a harmful precedent, potentially undermining the authority and contributions of a parent in shared custody arrangements. Navigating these conflicts required a careful balance of assertiveness and diplomacy. I needed to communicate clearly, document thoroughly, and, when necessary, escalate appropriately. The goal was not to antagonize my ex or create ongoing conflict, but to ensure that my children had unimpeded access to the resources provided for them. This required consistent enforcement of boundaries. Even in the face of resistance or emotional outbursts, The emotional toll of these interactions was significant. Repeatedly asserting my rights, confronting refusal, and defending my actions placed stress on both my personal well-being and the co-parenting relationship. However, each confrontation also reinforced the importance of persistence and clarity. My children's well-being depended on my ability to navigate these challenges effectively, protecting both their access to resources and the integrity of my role as a parent. I learned to anticipate potential disputes. Understanding my ex's tendencies allowed me to plan exchanges and interactions more strategically. I could foresee situations where property might be withheld and take proactive measures, such as scheduling pickups at times that minimized conflict or providing written reminders of ownership. While this level of planning was exhausting, it was necessary to safeguard both the children's access and my own. Each dispute highlighted broader challenges in co-parenting, particularly within blended families. New household members, stepchildren, and extended family relationships introduce complexities that require clear boundaries and assertive communication. Without these safeguards, the potential for conflict increases, often at the expense of the children. Recognizing this reality was crucial for maintaining stability and fairness within our shared custody arrangement. Through these experiences, I also reflected on the importance of maintaining emotional composure. Responding impulsively or angrily to each dispute could have escalated the situation, undermined my credibility, and negatively impacted the children. By remaining calm, documenting thoroughly, and choosing my battles strategically, I was able to enforce boundaries without creating unnecessary hostility. This approach, though challenging, proved essential in preserving both my rights and the well-being of my children. Over time, I established a clear understanding with my ex. Items provided for my children are exclusively for their use, and attempts to appropriate them for other family members will not be tolerated. While she initially resisted, the repeated enforcement of this principle eventually led to a begrudging acknowledgement. This was not a victory in the traditional sense, but a necessary clarification to maintain the integrity of my role as a parent and protect the children's interests. The process of standing my ground also required educating the children in age-appropriate ways about boundaries and ownership. They needed to understand that the tools, phones, and devices provided by me were for their use, and that asking for or taking them from others without permission was inappropriate. These lessons were subtle but essential, reinforcing respect, responsibility, and understanding within a complex family dynamic. Reflecting on the broader impact, I realized these disputes offered important lessons about co-parenting, respect, and the challenges of blended families. They demonstrated the necessity of clear communication, meticulous documentation, and assertive boundary setting. More importantly, they highlighted the critical role of the parent in ensuring fairness and access to resources, even when faced with resistance from the other household. Ultimately, these experiences shaped my approach to co-parenting. I became more vigilant, strategic, and assertive, ensuring that my children's needs were prioritized and their access to resources protected. I learned that maintaining boundaries is not about conflict for its own sake, but about preserving fairness, respect, and stability. Each dispute, while frustrating, reinforced the importance of proactive engagement and unwavering commitment to my children. Standing my ground was not easy. It required persistence, courage, and sometimes intervention from external authorities. But in the end, it was necessary to protect my role as a parent and safeguard my children's well-being. These experiences reinforce the importance of clear boundaries, mutual respect, and proactive communication in co-parenting, particularly within blended families where dynamics are inherently more complex. Through this journey, I discovered that asserting rights and maintaining boundaries is an essential component of effective parenting. My ex's repeated challenges underscored the importance of vigilance and strategic action, and each confrontation provided valuable lessons in negotiation, documentation, and emotional regulation. By standing firm, I ensured that my children could access the resources provided for them, while also modeling assertiveness and responsibility. In conclusion, navigating property disputes in a shared custody and blended family context is complex, emotionally taxing, and requires deliberate effort. These incidents over phones, tools, and iPods illustrate the broader principles of co-parenting: respect, fairness, and clarity. By asserting my rights, documenting interactions, and prioritizing my children's access to resources, I protected their well-being and reinforced my role as an engaged and responsible parent.